Hello there, friends. This is Spencer Michaud, and welcome to your weekly astrology forecast for the week of June 15th through the 21st. We've got a very busy week in the sky this week with Mercury, our friend Hermes, stationing retrograde at 14 degrees of Cancer. Mars will be making a sextile to Pluto, a retrograde Pluto at 24 degrees of Pisces and Capricorn, respectively. On Saturday, the 20th, Mars is going to be making a sextile to a retrograde Jupiter. And then the sun will be moving into the first decan of Cancer. So we're going to have a solar shift that's happening. And that is also the summer solstice, where we have the longest day of the year and when the night starts to return to growing in length. And then on Sunday, the 21st, if that wasn't enough, we're going to have a new moon solar eclipse at 0 degrees of Cancer, which should be very interesting. So let's dive right in here. Hope that you're all doing well. I'm going to share my screen. I have a lot of interesting things to get to today. Been doing a lot of reading with some new material. I've been really getting into Liz Greene, who is a more of a modern psychological Jungian astrologer, but she's very gifted at talking about myth and some of the stories behind some of the archetypes. And I've really been enjoying her work, especially her book, The Astrology of Fate. So I'm going to read a little bit from that book. In addition to that, I've been, doing a deep dive into Bernadette Brady's Fixed Stars book. So we'll talk a little bit about Mercury retrograding on the fixed star of Sirius this week as well. So that's part of our story. So one thing I wanted to do before we get into the essential dignities, as part of the essential dignities, what I want to start doing is talking about each planet and how it is relating, what types of aspects it's receiving from different planets this week. So like, for example, I have one chart on the screen here. And if we start off by talking about our sun in Gemini at the beginning of the week, it's going to start off at 24 degrees Gemini, where it is in its own face. It has rulership by face. It's in the terms of Saturn from 24 to 30 degrees. And it is co-present with Venus and the North Node this week. So we want to start thinking about what kind of relationships do each of these planets have with the other planets? Because remember, the Greeks thought of the chart or the sky as like this cosmic courtroom or this cosmic like city structure where each of the planets were emissaries of a deity that had specific relationships with one another, and were communicating and were giving witness and testimony on the life of a native and their fate. Been doing some really interesting explorations on the nature of fate, which I might make a separate video about, but Liz Greene is really great at describing the different ways of thinking about fate versus free will in her book. And a lot of these are echoed in some of the talks that Robert Schmidt gave in his Project Hindsight talks that were titled Fate, Allotment, and Decree. So the combination of those lectures and being able to read more about it in Liz Greene's book has been giving me a lot to chew on. And I guess just to make it short, basically the Greeks thought of fate as an allotment. Like it was the word for degree, I believe, is actually called morai or mora. And that word means an allotment. And so it's interesting to see that the zodiac itself is spoken as what we are being allotted in this lifetime. And then she goes on to talk about different types of fate. One is hemarmene, which is sort of like kind of the circumstances that you're born into. And we have the fate called ananke, which is also closely related to agnoia, both of those being of the nature of Saturn, or Saturn relating to these ideas where we're creating fate. We're compelled, ananke is the compelling of something towards something that may be through our ignorance as well. Agnoia is kind of the darkness or the ignorance. So we may be creating a type of fate where we're being compelled from our our ignorance, from not knowing any better. And then she goes on to describe a concept called pronoia, which is the fate that we are creating through our awareness and our foreknowledge. And that particular type of fate was most associated with the concept of grace or of providence in some of our religious texts, and that we may be able to make some changes, or we may be able to make some adjustments to either the severity or the types of experiences we may run into via the type of fate that is created through Hem or Mene. So the gist of it is, it boils down to, from what I'm understanding, is that we've got some events that we may not be able to avoid, but we may be able to make some adjustments based on some of our foreknowledge on whether we are using things like astrology to prepare ourselves mentally and emotionally to perhaps make a better choice within the moment of whatever circumstances we're being presented with. So I thought that was really interesting, and I'm sure that as I get further into these texts, I will have a greater understanding, but I wanted to just share a little bit of that as we move forward. So before I even dive into this, I want to talk about the period of time that we're going through right now is called the Bardo period. And that is a reference to one of the Tibetan books of the dead, where these periods in between eclipses, we had an eclipse last week, we had a full moon lunar eclipse over the Gemini and Sagittarius axis, and we are moving towards a set of eclipses over the Cancer Capricorn axis. And sometimes the in-between phases were thought of like this liminal space between life and death. The Bardo period in this Tibetan book had 3 stages, where you had the death itself and your awareness and coming to terms with it. A second stage where you're presented with all these frightening apparitions that could potentially lead you to reincarnating or a rebirth process that leads you away from liberation, which was one of the goals, I guess. I don't know if you'd call it a goal necessarily, but one of the things that we're trying to I don't know, come to terms with in Buddhism. And then the third stage being that transition into the new body. And we're doing that right now. We've got this kind of space where we're leaving some of the old things behind. We just went through a full moon eclipse where we're leaving something behind, and we're heading towards an eclipse where we're initiating something new, maybe being born into a new body of sorts, a new body as a collective consciousness, as a society, as individuals. So it's a really interesting time where we may be presented with some frightening imagery, and we have to kind of use our mental discipline and our faith and our hope and our pronoia to make the choices as to what kind of things we're going to create. And Cancer is all about creation. Cancer is all about birth and union of the body and the soul. So we'll get to that. Anyway, back to our essential dignities. So the sun is going to be co-present with Venus and with the North Node. It is also going to be aspected traditionally by a square, an overcoming square with Mars in the sign of Pisces. So we still have that active square that's happening. So that is a condition that is harming the sun this week. We have a overcoming trine with Saturn in Aquarius. So we do have aspects from both of the malefic planets this week to the sun. So that is creating a little bit of a difficulty. We are also going to be seeing as the sun moves into Cancer, it's going to start opposing Jupiter and Pluto. So those themes are going to start to become prevalent as we move forward in our week as well. In the beginning of the week, the sun is going to be provided resources by a very a slow-moving Mercury as it begins to station, which means it begins to slow down and is about to reverse course. So we're going to be kind of getting to this moment. And at any time a planet stations, that was said to be a condition of phasis, an omen that is speaking. So Mercury is getting ready to turn around and reevaluate a lot of the things that we've been going through over the last few weeks. and potentially go into the underworld as it goes under the beams of the sun. Mercury had significations and the role of psychopomp in traditional astrology and in Greek mythology. The psychopomp was a guide of souls to the underworld. So it echoes some of the themes of Mercury's ability to go between worlds and hold the duality of opposites. And I'm going to read some material from Liz Greene about Mercury that I thought was very poignant as well when we get further on in our dailies. Okay, so that's what we've got going on with the sun. The sun is going to move from 24 degrees of Gemini to 1 degree of Cancer. So we're going to change dignity. When the sun moves into Cancer, it is peregrine instead of having dignity by face, and it will be in the terms of Mars from 0 to 7 degrees. So not a lot of dignity for the sun, but it will change hosts. It will change hosts from Mercury to the moon. So the moon is the steward or the host of the sun, and it's going to be providing resources. And that is very interesting because the moon is going through a renewal this week with that supercharged solar eclipse. Okay, so Saturn this week is going to be in the sign of Aquarius, where it has rulership. It is the diurnal ruler of Aquarius. It also has triplicity dignity by the daytime, and it is in the terms of Mercury from 0 to 7 degrees. As I said before, Saturn is going to be aspecting both Venus and the sun, so by trine. So there's a potentially harmonious relationship between those three planets right now, even though Venus is in its retrograde phase. It is going to be, it will be aspecting, it is in aversion to Mars and Neptune, as well as to Mercury until it retrogrades back into Capricorn, which I believe doesn't happen until a week or two from now. So moving forward, we have Jupiter at 25 degrees of Capricorn, still retrograde right now as well, in its fall in the sign of Capricorn and in the terms of Saturn from 22 to 26 degrees. It is moving into a conjunction with Pluto that I believe is going to perfect on the 25th of June. So we're getting really close to another Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. I believe the first one that we experienced was in the middle of March. I could be wrong on that. It might have been May. I think it was March though. But anyway, a continuation of some of the themes of, decay, themes of expansion of corruption, themes of expansion of the supercharged energy of change and transformation. So a lot of the themes that we think about with Pluto in the third decan of Capricorn is kind of this nuclear volcanic energy that is sort of the you can think of it as the ability of the caterpillar to dissolve the DNA to be reformed into something new. And not just the birth itself, but the process of decay before the new birth as well. So we're right in the thick of that. Mars is going to be in the sign of Pisces still in the third decan of Pisces. As I'm recording this today on Saturday, what is the date today? The 13th. Mars is perfecting its conjunction with Neptune. So an interesting day as we are seeing the connection between the god of war and the god of the oceans, the god of illusion, the god of deception, the god of toxicity. So Neptune and Mars together has been creating this kind of desire to transcend, but drawing upon resources from that retrograde fallen Jupiter. So there's some belief systems that we may be trying to put out into the world and taking action on our beliefs in this kind of almost like this holy war type of crusade energy that may be based on a Jupiter that is in the process of contraction, right? Jupiter itself is drawing resources from Saturn, which is associated with darkness, at that agnoia and ananke energy, where we are trying to compost uh, some of our old belief systems so that we can create something new when the cycle starts to shift again. So, in addition to Mars being in the sign of Pisces, it does have dignity uh, as the triplicity ruler of the water signs by the nighttime. It will be in its own terms from 19 to 28 degrees, I believe. Let's see. Yep. Yeah. Moves into the terms of Saturn at 28 degrees. So powerful Mars, powerful Mars right now. It has some dignity. It's going to get even more powerful as it moves into Aries in a few weeks. But right now we've got kind of a shifty Mars that has some dignities, different types of dignity than being in its own domicile, but kind of this like watery, uh, you know, elusive martial quality. Again, some of the themes that we've been experiencing as Mars has gone through Pisces and made it square to the sun was a difficulty finding truth, perhaps some of our actions being taken through illusion, through the desire to like transcend, to escape. There may be some themes of escapism happening as well. Um, yeah, it's been a little bit of a rough sail with Mars moving through Pisces, especially with a host that's in the condition that it is right now. Moving forward to Venus. Venus is in the sign of Gemini, in the first decan of Gemini, where it is peregrine and it is still in its retrograde phase. It's in the terms of Jupiter from 6 to 12 degrees, and then moving into the terms of Mercury from 0 to 6 degrees. So Venus recently made its appearance, or it is about to after I record this on Sunday. If you're listening to this over the weekend, it will be making its appearance as a morning star, coming out from under the beams around Sunday evening. So there's some event that we may be experiencing as a collective and in our individual lives, in around the sign or the temple of Gemini, that is speaking to some kind of new Venusian mission, I would say. It just went into the heart of the sun. It had its rebirth at the inferior conjunction, and then when it makes its appearance as the morning star, Venus is ready to rumble. She's the warrior princess at that point, or the warrior goddess, I should say, more accurately. And she is ready to take action, potentially to attempt to unify, but in a more diurnal and aggressive and warrior type way. The essential nature of Venus is always to bring harmony, but sometimes she's willing to fight for that harmony, and sometimes she's willing to wait for it. And she's fighting for it right now. Moving through the sign of Gemini, we've been trying to reconcile these opposites, and sometimes we have to be shown really how far apart we are in some things, and how dualistic our experience has been. We've seen a lot of this with the Black Lives Matter movement, where a lot of it has been about bringing awareness to how unjust and unfair our system really is, and how different the experience might be between people of color and people who are white or in the majority. And that's something that, well, we've been seeing a lot in social media, with a lot of articles circulating about what type of what type of experience really that people are having, and how to have empathy for that experience, and not just to how to have empathy, but how to really take action and potentially bring more fairness, equality, and justice to the system itself. As I was speaking of last week, just as Black, Indigenous people of color are born into a system that is unjust, so are white people born into that same system that gives them privilege. And a lot of the times, the people that are born into the position of privilege um, do not have to think about things in the same way as the people that were born into a system of oppression. And a lot of, I think, the hard work that's being done right now, especially in white communities, is learning more, like Gemini, asking questions about that privilege, and trying to make the change from that position of privilege. Because when we have systemic racism, a lot of the hard work is not necessarily doesn't need to be done by the people of color. The hard work actually needs to be done by the, the person in privilege to dismantle that system. When you are a person of power in a system, you have the ability to make changes within that system. And I think that's a lot of what we've been experiencing as a collective right now. And it's really interesting times. It's not comfortable all the time. It's not a place of, um, you know, we've had that Venus retrograde energy where it's difficult to find a consensus. Um, but through doing that hard work, through that discomfort, through the awareness of the differences in experience, eventually that will lead to a different a birth of a new harmonization. At least that's my hope. That's the hard work that I've been doing on a personal level, is trying to just become aware of any blind spots that I might potentially have, and then take well-informed actions based on that particular position. And having tough conversations with relatives and friends, and trying to call people in versus calling people out. I think that's one of the mistakes I made as a someone who wanted to be an ally, I guess you could call it. Um, but what I would do was I would let my emotions get the better of me, and I would call out the people in my life. And I think as a society, it's important to call out injustices and to make people aware of that. But I think on an individual level, it is more effective to call people in, as far as giving people actionable steps to make change. Because I think that if we get fixated just on shaming or guilting, that's when we can start to really, people can put up the walls and the defenses, and where we might bring someone into the cause or into the mission of actually creating significant change, that calling out on that personal level could cause people to shut down and erect even stronger defenses. And that's something I've really been working on personally, because my initial instinct is to get angry about something and to call people out. Like, I think one of the flaws, or superpowers, or flaws you could call it, as being a Cancerian sun, and embodying some of the mother archetype energy. A mother can give encouragement, and a mother can also shame. And I think that that's something that I've had to really work through, embodying that Cancerian archetype. Is how do I encourage growth through my ability to give life rather than to take it away. And what we'll talk about that as we move through Cancer this week is there is duality involved in that. The mother is consuming to give life, but also we can have this kind of Ouroboros type of relationship where the Ouroboros was the snake or the dragon that was consuming its own tail. Um, so there are dual qualities of building up and tearing down within this archetype as well, within this particular temple archetype. And we can think of it not just as a temple, but as a field of mm, a field of concretization, where where planetary archetypes or essences are able to be born into form. So it's kind of like a place where we're seeing the planets manifest into concrete material things through the birth channel of the sign or of the temple. It's like a gateway. Think of these signs as gateways. So we've got divine energy that's trying to birth itself through these doorways of the signs. And there's only a certain amount of types of forms that are available to the divine energy to manifest within in the different temples. And that energy is provided for by its host. So in that temple of Cancer, our host is the moon. So those are the types of archetypes that are able to be born. The types of forms are lunar. All right. So moving forward, I'm going to have a few digressions this particular forecast, I think, because my mind's just swimming with all this information, and apologize if that's hard to follow sometimes. We've got a Mars-Neptune aspect perfecting today, so bear with me. So Mercury is going to be retrograde in the sign of Cancer. It will have dignity by in the second face. So it is one of the, it does have rulership by face. Mercury being one of the, is the Chaldean ruler, whereas the other ruler, I guess, is Mars in the triplicity system. It will be on its own terms from 13 to 19 degrees, but it is slowing down. It is slowing down to turn retrograde. So we'll break that all down. The moon is waning from its last quarter phase into the new moon eclipse, where it starts to gain in light again. It'll be peregrine in the sign of Aries. It will be in its exaltation, have triplicity rulership, and be in have rulership by face in the second decan of Taurus. And then it moves into a peregrine condition in the sign of Gemini. And finally, it will land in the sign of Cancer, where it has domicile rulership, where it is the host of that particular temple. All right, so that's the essential dignity for the week. Let's move forward to our dailies, and I will kind of break down some of these concepts as we move through our week. So on Monday, June the 15th, I'm going to start moving through the hours here. So the sun's still in Gemini on Monday. We are seeing a last quarter moon phase with the moon in Aries, moving off of that square between the moon in Pisces and the moon in Gemini, where we're going through and continuing through a shift, maybe a little bit of an existential crisis, where we're trying to incorporate all the lessons that we've learned over this last Gemini moon cycle, which included an eclipse, and trying to integrate them into our consciousness and into our reality. And on Monday the 15th, the moon is going to be squaring retrograde Pluto at 6:21 p.m. It'll be making a sextile to the sun at 8:10 p.m. at 25 degrees of Aries and Gemini. And then it'll be squaring the retrograde Jupiter at 8:49 p.m. So Monday is going to be continuing those themes that started over the weekend, about maybe reconsidering some of the things that we're doing, maybe potentially reconsidering some of our belief systems, but especially since we had the South Node in Sagittarius over that eclipse, being provided for by that fallen Jupiter that is conjunct Pluto, composting those old beliefs, letting go of things that aren't serving us as a collective and personally, letting go of maybe some of the injustices that we are that have been brought to our attention, some of those unconscious biases even. We're seeing the disillusion or the dissolving of a lot of the structures of governance that we've been experiencing for a long time as well, with a lot of police departments disbanding or the call to defund them and kind of recreate the way that we take care of our citizens, the way that we support them through potentially more community-based initiatives and things like that. I'm still learning about all of this as well. Like the whole defund the police movement is kind of it's a new one to me that I don't fully have a complete understanding of yet. But from what I have read, it's in some cases there may be like a, disbanding and reforming type of energy, but a lot of it is about reallocating resources from the militarization of the police through having all these like tanks and heavy duty artillery weapons and things like that, and potentially giving over more of those resources that we would use to equip them to potentially more social programs. I believe one of the arguments is that a police officer is being asked right now to not only be a public safety officer, but be a social worker and be a counselor and be a therapist, be a marriage counselor, be a mental health expert, all of those things that they may not have been properly trained for. And by reallocating resources to these types of social positions in our communities, we may be able to uh, send out the right type of properly trained person for different situations, and keep our police force for other types of specific purposes that they may be better trained for. That's my understanding at this point. There could be some things that I'm missing within that, and there could be different perspectives on that as well. I don't think that what people are calling for is a free for all or chaos. I've been doing a lot of learning about the police force in the past few weeks too. Saw a really great lecture by Samuel Reynolds that I highly recommend, that I've shared on my Facebook page, talking about the history of policing in America. And one of the things that he is very specific to point out is that the police force has been it started off as, I believe, trying to round up runaway slaves and to maintain white privilege, and to maintain the property and the superiority of the people that were in power. And it is it has been since used as an instrument of capitalism to maintain sort of a corporate oligarchy, I guess. I don't know. I'm diving into the deep waters here again. Um, and I don't want to confuse the facts either. Like I'm trying to draw upon these a lot of different things right now, and I don't want to confuse the issue. But go listen to Sam Reynolds talk. It was an Association for Young Astrologers talk that he gave in July of last year, where he talks about Pluto and the police system in America. And he makes a number of really great points that are very, very well researched, talking about the history of policing in America in particular, and how it has been used to uphold systemic oppression and inequality. And uh, I really think that he's got a lot of great stuff that he puts forward. And before you get like upset about it, if you're on the other side of the fence, um, I think one of the things that we need to do is hear a lot of different perspectives right now and understand our history, because the lot yes, there are individual cases of people that were trying to do good within a corrupt system, um, but we are at a moment where a more we're examining the big picture. What Saturn is asking us to do in Aquarius right now is to hover over our life and look at how we've gotten to this point, not just as individuals, but as a society, and the agreements that we have made as a culture. And I think that that is the proper way to go through these changes, is to try as much as possible not to take the changes as personally as you can. Now, you might want to do the hard work of examining what your role is within that society and how you may have benefited or been oppressed by systems. But again, having a little bit of objectivity is going to help to not immediately go to a defensive position and say, just as the people that have been oppressed have been born into this system, I too have been born into a system of privilege. And examining the privilege and oppression dichotomy, that's the duality that we're working through, especially with like Mercury and Cancer now. Like, who is being nurtured and who is being denied? That is one of the themes too of like Cancer versus Capricorn. And we've got really important planets right now asking us to compost the old ways of you know of death, decay, oppression, and we're being asked to figure out, how do we nurture each other in new ways? How do we give life? How do we give um, support to people in a more equitable fashion? And this is something we're going to be working through the summer as well. And I think that a lot of what we're seeing with Jupiter Pluto is um, a lot of times when people have power and when people have been given privilege, there are two ways you can react to that privilege being threatened, or the thought of it being taken away or it being redistributed. You can go through it willingly. You can go through it and say, you know what, maybe I have benefited from this, and maybe it is important for me now to think about the world in a more equitable fashion, and realize that that is part of how the society that I've been living within has been built. And this goes back generations too. This isn't just about like your own Protestant work ethic or pulling yourselves up by your bootstraps or things like that. The fact of the matter is that uh, for many, many generations, there were advantages that were given to the people that were in the majority group that made it a lot easier to do that. Not saying that people who have had privilege haven't been hard workers, or there haven't been like, and again, I mentioned this in a talk that I gave with Stormie Grace. So go check that out. I talked about the planets. She's a wonderful interviewer and astrologer and has a lot of good insights and a cool channel. And I was talking about just, we got into a discussion about current events too. And one of the points made is that, you know, there are many different ways to be oppressed, and there's many different ways to have privilege. And race is just one way that you can have privilege or be oppressed by. Other ways of feeling oppressed could be economic. Other ways of feeling oppressed could be by gender, or could be by um, sexual orientation. So just because you have privilege in one area of life does not mean that you're not simultaneously oppressed in a different area of life. So I think being able to hold that duality is important, and that I think that helps with some of the conversations too, because I've had a lot of conversations with people who say, well, I'm not privileged, you know, I'm poor, and that's a different type of oppression, and that needs to be examined as well. I think we're going through that process right now too, with the equal distribution of wealth being something that is a conversation, but it is at the same time wrapped up in, but also separate from the acknowledgement of privilege by race as well. Um, it, Reality is multivalent. I think that's the thing. As we move through the last degrees of Gemini Sun and our awareness, we're being asked to make a choice. We're being asked to say, what do we choose? What are we going to feed? What are we going to nurture? And what needs to be left behind? And it does definitely take an ability to hold some of these opposing, um, you know, gray areas, these types of ambiguities, and it's tough. I really empathize with many people right now who are going through asking themselves the tough questions and going through that, and um, because it is important, though. It is. All right, so that is Monday the 15th. Uh, as we move forward to Tuesday the 16th, we are seeing a continuation of our last quarter phase. Okay. The moon moves into Taurus on the 16th, excuse me, at 5:35 a.m., where it is gaining dignity. It's gaining dignity by exaltation. The moon generally is more fertile in this particular sign. It is able to bring things more into manifestation. Now, the interesting thing that we have going on with this particular phase, though, is we're moving into a last quarter balsamic phase. So having a last quarter Taurus moon myself, I can speak to this a little bit. Um, One of the things that I've done in my research, learning about this particular position, is that uh, when you have a Taurus moon, but it's waning, there may be an ability to consistently remove obstacles to manifestation, or to remove bad habits. So instead of being so like procreative, this may be a moon where we're able to calmly and centeredly remove any of the negativity, or remove any obstacles to what may be getting in the way of manifestation. The other thing that's good about Taurus moon, though, is it does lend a little bit of stability to our emotional nature. It speaks of consistency and being consistent in our routines, and consistently sowing the seeds that we need to do to create fecundity. I love that word. That's a word I learned from Austin Coppock, fecundity, which is, you know, being able to sow the earth and quicken it with vitality and see things come to fruition. On this particular day, Tuesday the 16th, the moon is going to be making a square to retrograde Saturn at 0 degrees of Taurus and Aquarius at 7:29 a.m. So we may be coming face to face with some of the hard truths that are informing our decision making and our awareness this particular cycle. As the moon moves into Taurus too, it's going to become co-present with Uranus. And Uranus is going, that aspect isn't going to perfect till the very early hours of Wednesday, but it's going to be informing the kind of energy that we're feeling on Tuesday, the 16th. So we may be really getting shaken up out of our old routines. Uranus was associated with Prometheus in both Liz Greene's work and in Richard Tarnas's work in Cosmos and Psyche. And I'm actually realizing that before Richard Tarnas wrote Cosmos and Psyche, I believe in 2001, Liz Tarnas was talking about Prometheus a long time ago. And I believe this book, The Astrology of Fate, 1984 was, she was talking about Uranus as Prometheus, which I thought was really interesting. It may have been one of the sources that Tarnas was drawing upon. They could potentially be contemporaries too, so I don't know who. It doesn't really matter, to be honest with you, who discovered what. It's a kind of a chicken or an egg thing, but I wanted to kind of give a shout out to Liz Greene on this because I'm really enjoying her writing. And after studying Hellenistic astrology for going on 3 years now, it's really interesting to return to the roots of like a psychological and myth-based astrology as well, and see that within the context of the Hellenistic system. It really lends a lot of depth. It lends a lot of awareness and understanding where we can kind of begin to reunify those systems. I went through a Promethean schism, I would say, when Uranus was moving through Aries in my 9th house of belief system, associated with astrology too. And that's when I kind of started to leave some of my modern astrological practices behind and learn about the Hellenistic system. And it was this huge, kind of lightning bolt where it was shattering a lot of preconceptions that I'd had about astrology after studying modern astrology for over a decade, and introduced me to like this, I don't know, I think of it now as a gift from the gods, and of all these techniques that were part of this beautiful, coherent system that answered a lot of questions that were shrouded in ambiguity when I was studying modern astrology. Like they were kind of like, this is what this means, but my questions of why were never answered to my satisfaction. And in studying the Hellenistic system and traditional astrology in general, it just really gave me a greater awareness. So now going back to the myth and trying to reconnect that with how we think as human beings, how that does affect a psyche, and simultaneously being able to hold astrology as being divinatory and event-based and concrete, where we can see the planets representing concrete events, but also bringing it back to that awareness of it being part of the psyche as well, and part of our internal experience, as above, so below, as within, so without. It's like, it's that kind of hermetic wisdom where we're seeing things in our external world being echoed in our minds, in our experience, in our soul, in our inner being. And I'm just finding that really, really enriching right now. And I don't think it would have been possible without without really both of those types of experiences and both of those types of awarenesses. And so anyway, go get Liz Greene's book. I'll put it on my book list. Okay. So that's what we've got going on Saturday. I'm sorry, Saturday. Today's Saturday. On Tuesday, the 16th, okay, is mostly that connection with the moon to Uranus and making a square to Saturn. And Saturn is in the overcoming position, so there may be some of the coming into contact with some of our own limitations, with our experiences that that may have been shrouded in darkness, Saturn being associated with that agnoia and ananke, the type of karma and fate that we create through our ignorance and through not knowing any better, being compelled through ignorance. I love that. I used to call ananke the ignorance, but there's reading Liz Greene's work has given me a little bit more of a nuance to it, where ananke is the force that compels us, and agnoia is the darkness, is the not knowing. So we are being compelled through our ignorance to create fate or to be subject to it. And I think that if I was to ground this more in a chart, I think that if we don't have awareness of these things, I think then there's plenty of us that are just living out our lives that have no understanding of astrology or no understanding of divine wisdom or anything like that. A lot of folks like that, and some of us that do have some of this as well, because we're not perfect. We're not always going to make decisions based on our higher selves. Is a lot of times we're living out what is written in the chart just through our unawareness of it. So like, let's say you have like a Mars square, I don't know, Mars square Jupiter. Okay. And I'm going to talk about Mars Jupiter later in the show here. But you may be living out themes of accelerating self-aggrandizement or ambition or expansion, being aggressively dogmatic with that particular aspect through potentially not knowing any better. And if we're thinking about how do we bring more agency into our lives, if you had an awareness, pronoia, of that tendency, of that thread, okay, they thought of Hemarmene as a thread, or the three mori. One of them weaves the thread, the other measures it, and then the last one cuts it. I don't remember what the exact names of the three moirai were. I believe one was Lachesis. Oh, I don't know. I'm going to butcher all of that trying to draw that from the memory banks right now. But if you look at the three fates, you had one that was spinning the thread. You had another that was measuring it out. And then the next one that was severing it and cutting it. And our awareness of that thread that we're creating could potentially lead us to either downplay some of those tendencies or the severity of the negativity. It's kind of like, you probably are going to manifest some kind of challenge with a Mars-Jupiter square in your life, especially if Mars is overcoming. But, I believe I've heard it compared to, let's say you were going to sustain some sort of injury, like if one of those planets represented injury. It could be the difference between, breaking your leg and having a very severe injury, or like just like getting a scrape or a bruise or something like that. Like, you are going to experience some kind of concretized event related to that aspect, but you may be able to avoid some of the more challenging parts of it through your awareness. Okay, let's move forward to Wednesday, the 17th. On Wednesday, June the 17th, the moon is still going to be in Taurus in the balsamic phase now, which is the dark phase of the moon. In Liz Greene's book, she also talks about the triple goddess, where we talk about the moon as mother, as maiden, and as crone, right? So we have the moon in the Hecate phase, where she is the crone, where she's coming to terms with old age and incorporating all that wisdom and seeing form start to decay. And we're kind of trying to process all the lessons that we've learned from the previous lunar cycle and figure out what needs to stay from what we've learned and what needs to be gotten rid of. Okay, so the moon is going to perfect that conjunction to Uranus at 9 degrees of Taurus at 12:15 in the AM, so just shortly after midnight. It will sextile Mercury at 11:03 AM at 14 degrees of Taurus and Cancer, and then it will sextile Neptune at 11:18 p.m. from 20 degrees of Taurus to 20 degrees of Pisces. Now, one of the things I wanted to discuss on this day is Mercury. And this will be part of our theme as we move towards Mercury retrograde. But on Wednesday, the concept I wanted to introduce is that Mercury is going to be conjoining on the ecliptic the fixed star Sirius. And Sirius generally has a zodiacal position of around 14 degrees of Cancer. Now, if you want to get all technical and talk about parans and things like that, there may be a different position for it, but this is where it is on the ecliptic. I'm not using parans for this particular concept. I'm using its conjunction. Now, I believe that when a planet is conjunct, I could be conflating some of this, but I believe that the planet will be culminating at the top of the chart when it's conjunct. It's Mercury will be at this point, at this degree. So it sort of works both ways. Now let's talk about Sirius, because Sirius is one of the brightest stars in the heavens. It is part of the constellation Canis Major, or the dog. It is the guardian of the underworld, or one of the guides to the underworld. It's associated with the Egyptian myth of Isis and reconstruction of her lover Osiris. We'll talk about that as well. There are some, it is, right now it is our pole star. It is our North Star. It was the star that the Egyptians associated with the floodings of the Nile and of birth and the primordial waters. It was the heralding of the Cancerian season. So we're going to extract a lot of our meaning from some of those themes as well. Now, let's talk a little bit about this Isis myth, because I think this is important. When we're using fixed stars are, in our celestial sphere model, and I talked about this a little bit in my talk with Stormie Grace. So if you want to know more about celestial spheres, go check that out on her channel. The fixed star sphere was outside of the 7 planetary spheres. It was said to be more, more divine, because the fixed stars were the ones that were always consistent in relationship to one another. And the ancients associated consistency with divinity, and change with the realm of fortune and the realm of this world. So we had these unchanging types of qualities, and everything was revolving around that pole star. Now, I have a book coming in the mail called Hamlet's Mill that I've been waiting on for a month, because for whatever reason the postal service has been super slow. Probably due to COVID and all these funding challenges and stuff like that. But I have both Bernadette Brady's book of planets and fixed stars, which is a supplementary book to her other book of fixed stars that I already have, planet combinations, which would be useful. I'm sort of having to draw these combinations myself without reading Brady's thoughts on it beyond just her regular fixed star book. And then I have that Hamlet's Mill book coming in the mail, which is a book about how we created, I believe it's about cosmoarchaeology. So how we've created stories and mythology through our observation of the heavens, which would be pretty useful for an astrologer, wouldn't you say? One of the themes that I've just been reading from Brady, because Brady is one who draws upon that book a lot, is that as we've experienced the concept called precession, where the planets, or the stars, the fixed stars, start to precess, and the zodiac itself starts to precess or move and change its position. There's this mythological themes of the death of certain deities, and subsequently the birth of different ones. Like when we had I believe when we had one of the constellations that, now, like I said, I don't have the book yet, but from what I'm understanding from the way Brady describes it, there's like a whirlpool that the constellations are descending into, and they're being swallowed up by this whirlpool due to precession. And precession is like the destabilization of this perfect unchanging world. It's like if even the gods can change, that's like this fall from grace, so to speak. And certain constellations were being swallowed up in the whirlpool of precession. And basically what precession is it's a condition that is due to the wobble of the earth, where the sky appears, the position of the constellation appears to shift over time. And this is one of the reasons we have like a difference in the tropical zodiac, which is based on the solstice now, and the sidereal zodiac, which was based specifically on the position of the constellation. So they're off now. So in Jyotisha and in Vedic astrology, a lot of them use the sidereal signs, which are different than our tropical signs. But Western Hellenistic astrology, from what most people can discover, has been tropical from the very beginning. But when it was first being formulated, the tropical zodiac and the sidereal zodiac were fairly in alignment. And as we've moved out of alignment, that's been, talked about as being symbolic of like, the fall of man, or so to speak. So that's one concept to think about. But back to Sirius. Sirius is a star that was rising. They talked about the dog days of summer with Sirius because it was, said to be rising in the heat of summer. It was very bright. It was associated with heat. It was associated with brightness. And in this myth of Isis, in the Isis story, Isis was married to Osiris, and she had, I believe it was her brother Set, who became jealous of Osiris. And Set was the god of war, of storms, of chaos. Okay, and he has correlations with the monster Typhon in Greek mythology. So Set got jealous of Osiris and Isis's relationship, and tricked Osiris into putting himself into this kind of coffin-like box. And Set sent him down the river, and eventually, like, I guess that box was consumed by a tree. And there are parts of the story where when Isis was trying to recover her husband, Set split Osiris into many different pieces and scattered them across the land. And eventually Isis had to try to recover those pieces with the help of Set's wife. I don't remember her name off the top of my head. And reconstruct Osiris. So this is a death and rebirth type of story. And Isis was only able to recover enough of the pieces to mate with Osiris, and then eventually born the son Horus. And after the mating, I believe that they couldn't find the phallus or the penis of Osiris. Like, that was lost. Like, which is interesting, because then you have to figure out, well, how did they do what they did? But yeah, there's all sorts of leaps of logic in classical mythology, but I digress. So eventually Osiris became, the lord of the underworld in the Egyptian myth. And so there's some interesting themes of death and rebirth with Sirius. Again, Sirius was the dog that was the guardian of the underworld. And so we've got these kind of themes of trying to, my thoughts when I was reading these stories and these mythologies was, as Mercury is stationing on this degree, and anytime a planet stations, that kind of supercharges the energy of it. And Mercury also had qualities of being a psychopomp, of going in between worlds, of the world of the mortal world and the underworld. And we have Mercury as messenger, okay, who is trying to hold these dualities. As I'm seeing this as Mercury the messenger trying to go into the underworld and recover and reclaim all of the pieces that have been split apart by Set, the god of chaos, of war, the storms. We've been going through a period of time where Set has been, or Pan could be another way of thinking about it. I don't know if they're essentially analogous, but we could see them having some similar qualities of creating chaos, right? We've been seeing chaos reign on the realm of in the mortal realm over the past few weeks, where everything feels like it's up in the air, and we're in this Bardo period, this transition period. And Mercury right now, Hermes, is going to be responsible for going between the worlds and collecting all the pieces and drawing upon that energy of Sirius and those mythological themes of collecting, like Isis, all the pieces that were scattered throughout the land, all the disparate ideas, all the shattered truths, all the shattered belief systems that we were holding on to, and recreating through hope, through a new system. And I think this is really important, and I want to make this a point. She's not trying to recreate the old system. She's not saying Osiris has to be born again. She's only recreating enough to be able to create a new birth. And I'm going to pause for impact, because I think that's really, I was thinking about that. I was like, wow, that's really cool. We're not trying to go back to quote unquote normal. There is no going back to normal with the awareness that we have now. And maybe the normal was so flawed. Why would we want to go back to that? Unless we are just completely delusional and completely living with our head in the sand, how can we possibly want to maintain that old corrupt system unless we are trying to be agents of oppression? And I don't know about you, and I don't want to be an agent of oppression. I want to be an agent of the quality and of truth and of fairness, and where we can live in harmony, because we cannot live in harmony if we have oppression. And I say this, with with like I'm standing on the pulpit, like on my soapbox here, with religious fervor of Mars Neptune conjoining, that if we fail to treat others the same way that we want to be treated, we cannot have peace, and we cannot have the type of grace that we want to create, and the type of harmony that we want to create, if one of us is suffering. And only through ignorance will we be able to live with peace any longer. Only through ignorance, only through ananke and agnoia. And man, that's powerful. That is a powerful moment of change in our history. We can choose to live in ignorance, or we can choose to be part of the return of the light and the birth of the new society. And yeah, pretty powerful stuff with Mercury stationing on Sirius, that dog star. Another theme of Sirius is a quest for immortality at the expense of the mortal body. Okay, and we can see that wrapped up in the Isis myth too. I did some research for one of my classes on this particular fixed star in relationship to Michael Jordan. Now, I have my son is pretty close to Sirius. It's within 1 degree of Sirius, and so I feel this energy powerfully. And Michael Jordan had Sirius directly on his ascendant. So you could see this quest for immortality at the expense of like the mortal coil. And when I was doing my art and my music, there were often times I would forget to eat, I would forget to sleep. When I was doing my album a few years ago, I was really running myself into the ground because I had this deep desire to create something divine and to create through that primordial water and be a channel of that divinity. And this is a great transition. This is a great uh, sequitur here to Thursday. So I'm going to talk about Thursday, June 18th here, because on Thursday, Mercury is going to be stationing retrograde at that 14 degrees. And you can see now Mercury is in red here, stationing retrograde. Okay. And we are going to, I'm going to talk about Mercury here because I think that Liz Greene has some great stuff about Mercury. First, let me go through the moon aspects. Moon is going to sextile Mars from 24 degrees of Taurus to 24 degrees of Pisces at 5:16 a.m. It's going to trine retrograde Pluto at 24 degrees at 6 a.m. Then it will make its trine to Jupiter retrograde at 8:02 a.m. Right on, moon's going to be close to Algol at that point. So again, that's one where you got to watch out for getting a little too, like losing your head due to like maybe your belief systems. The moon will move into Gemini at about 5 p.m. or so. And then it's going to make a trine from 0 degrees Gemini to Saturn at 0 degrees Aquarius retrograde at 6:34 p.m. So those are our lunar aspects for the day. So, you know, kind of some harmonious aspects, but with challenging placements. So the beginning of the day, we may be really, there is harmony between the light, the moon, and the agents of death. Okay. So this may be the time where we're really doing the good hard work of letting go of some of the old stuff. And I really think that's part of the role of the malefics, is how do we let go of things and compost things so that we eventually can have the return to the light. Now, you're not, my teacher Achyuta Bhavadas, my astrology teacher, makes this a point too, that you can't just think of the darkness in context with the light. You have to appreciate the darkness for what it is, and don't just try to go through the hard stuff so you can get to the good stuff. Like it's kind of like, don't just eat your vegetables so you can have your dessert, you know. Like you know, the dessert is tasty, but we have to acknowledge that the vegetables are providing a lot of nutrients. So appreciating that darkness for what it is, rather than saying, well, it's just part of the return to the light. I think that's important, because I tend to be, we all can fall into that pattern too. All right. So there's one other aspect on Thursday that is important. We're going to see a sextile between Mars and retrograde Pluto at 7:08 p.m., which could add to the volcanic catharsis of the moment. It could be an acceleration of change. It could be adding fuel to the fires of fermentation, adding vitality to that process, or adding anger and aggression. You know, it could be a point where we're getting, you know, Alan White was a great astrologer from Project Hindsight who talked about kind of nuclear fusion and fission in relationship to Pluto, where it can make big things small and make small things big. So it could be blowing, you know, some of our uh, impulses towards holy sacrifice way out of proportion, or in other cases minimizing something very important and trying to make it small. So keep your eye out for that particular aspect. But what I wanted to talk about on Thursday is Mercury's retrograde cycle. Now, we just got done talking about Mercury drawing upon the energy of the fixed star Sirius starting on Wednesday. And what I want to do is I want to read to you a passage from Liz Greene's book, The Astrology of Fate, because it gives some really interesting context to Mercury in general, and some things I want to talk about as far as why Mercury is associated with ambiguity, with trying to hold the duality of opposites, of light and dark, of its quality as a destabilizer, and its association too with Gemini and Virgo. And there's a lot of interesting truths that can come from this. Now, this is page 194 in her chapter on myth and zodiac. She's talking about Gemini, but Mercury in particular. She says the character of Hermes, Hermes is the Greek name for Mercury, embodies within itself this ambiguity and flickering of light and shade, of which the twins are another emblem. Hermes is Zeus's cleverest son. He was born to Maia, which is both the name of a nymph and also the name by which Zeus addresses the Greek goddess Night when he seeks an oracle of her. Okay, so that's important. So Hermes is the son of Zeus, which is interesting because he's always kind of, defying the king or dad. So there might be some like paternal issues with like Mercury arguing with the king, where the king's trying to confirm and stabilize things, and you've got this impetuous child trying to say, well, no, I'm this teenager that wants to like shake things up, right? Okay, so that could be one thing. But also what I think is even more interesting is the combination of Zeus, which is knowledge and associated with light and wisdom, with Maya, which is the nighttime, the darkness. So being able to hold duality is spoken of in the myths itself as being a child of both the light and the dark. And we can see this in the Thema Mundi too, as Mercury takes its joy in the first house, the place right on the horizon where we have the emergence from the darkness into the light. Okay, so he says, thus Hermes is not just the child of any ordinary woman. She is an older, more powerful deity, and the mating of Zeus and Maya becomes not just another of his usual rapes, but the union of the bright spirit with the dark, unfathomable depths of the unconscious and of nature itself. So Liz Greene says what I just said in a much more eloquent way. Zeus, it is said in the story, courted her in a dark cave under the cover of night, and she bore a son of great cunning, a deceitful flatterer, a robber and a cattle thief, a bringer of dreams and a nightly prowler. As Karenyi puts it, as are those who lurk in the streets before the gates. Hermes began his checkered career by inventing the lyre, which is like a guitar, and stealing his brother Apollo's cattle. He later became initiated messenger on the path to the house of Hades in the underworld, thereby fulfilling the office of psychopompos, or psychopomp, the escort of souls. Thus he can traverse the world above and below, and the mortal realm which lies in between. He is the only deity who is not assigned a place, for his place is the borderland, the roads and passageways, the crossroads where suicides are buried and criminals hung. Human beings benefit from Hermes, but sometimes he willfully leads them astray into the dark night. Interestingly, one version of the god's birth makes him the twin brother of Aphrodite. They are both children of the sky god Uranus, or Uranus, and share the same birthday on the 4th day of the lunar month. Their son, Eros, the great daimon of love and discord. This curious tale of Hermes' birth offers us another dimension to his character, for he is far more than a mere trickster. He is twin and soulmate, and his soulmate is the goddess of fertility, and their child is an image of the great binding force of life. Hermes fosters relationship even through quarreling and separateness. Okay, that's interesting. Fosters relationship even through quarreling and separateness, and brings things together through their differences, and vice versa. According to Walter Otto's description, Hermes lacks dignity, quote unquote. His strength lies in his resourcefulness. He accomplishes his deeds through guile and enchantment. Magic is more appropriate to him than heroism, which is perhaps why in the Renaissance, the magical texts which we met earlier were assigned to thrice great Hermes. He is an arch wizard and a patron of magicians. From him also comes gain, cleverly calculated or wholly unexpected, but mostly the latter. Okay. He says, Otto writes, this is his true characterization. If a man finds valuables on the road, if a man has a sudden stroke of luck, he thanks Hermes. The regular word for windfall is hermaion, The familiar expression for avidity is common Hermes. To be sure, a man must take a good deal of trouble before he receives the gift of this god, but in the end it is always a lucky find. The Hindu god Pushan is a parallel of Hermes, for this god also knows the way and leads the way in keeping a man from straying. All right, so there's more about Hermes that she talks about there, but that's enough to process here. So if we were to break that down, Hermes holds duality through lightness and darkness, through being the son of Zeus and Maya, the darkness. He was initiated as a go-between between worlds, so some of that ambiguity. Another way of thinking about Mercury or Hermes as the destabilizing force is based on some conversations I've had with my astrology teacher, Achyuta Das, and his understanding of some material with Robert Schmidt. So I want to make sure that I acknowledge both of those people and these concepts. And he and I have talked about Mercury, and this was a concept that he introduced, as the destabilizing force and transition between the light and the dark. So here's what I'm thinking, and here's part of what we were talking about. Mercury is associated with Gemini and Virgo. In the relationship to the seasons and the lightness and the darkness, Gemini directly precedes or is the mutable, changeable sign before the summer solstice. And the summer solstice is the point where we have the longest day of the year, where the sun is kind of rising to its peak and then starts to descend and the days become shorter. So we have this kind of quality when we get to Cancer of the descent of the power of the light. So what Mercury is doing is creating that confusion, that destabilization of the power of the light. And the same thing happens with the relationship between Mercury in Virgo and the fall equinox. Because what happens at this, because we've got the summer solstice with the transition from Gemini to Cancer. And then we have the fall equinox with the transition from the again, cadent, mutable, changeable sign of Virgo to the fall equinox, where the days and the nights become equal. And we have the transition to the days becoming shorter and the nights becoming longer. So both times, Mercury is an agent of bringing the darkness, and in darkness we can associate with ignorance or doubt, right? Of the unknown. And Mercury is a agent of the unknown. It is ferrying souls to the underworld too. Okay, so it is a messenger, but it is, when we're asking questions, when I've been saying over the past few weeks with the North Node in Gemini, ask questions, cast doubt, release certainty. It is the opposite of the transition that we see with Jupiter ruling Sagittarius and Pisces, okay, where we see the return of the light, the confirmation, the pulling together of resources for the light to return, both at the winter solstice, where the days start to increase in length, and at the spring equinox, where the days start to become longer than the nights. So we have both of those planets being transitionary, ruling cadent signs, and one of them is casting doubt. The other is about the hopeful return of the light and casting wisdom, with the sun being related to knowing and knowledge and the light of the mind. And that's like just starting to like really just like, I don't know, that concept really is helping me understand so many facets of astrology with Jupiter, Mercury, Pisces, Sagittarius, Virgo, Gemini. It's all starting to coalesce into like understanding. And I just thought that was worth sharing, because we have to understand what Mercury is trying to do with this retrograde. So let me Let me get rid of that off my screen here. Okay. So if Mercury is going in search of those pieces of Osiris, right, and trying to recreate something new, not necessarily to sustain the old body, but to birth a new body, all right? The next thing that I think we need to do is think about the cycle of Mercury, okay? Because there is a thing called Mercury's synodic cycle that's going to give us additional meaning to this Mercury retrograde. Now, you've seen me talk about in the past the two types of motion in the zodiac. One that is clockwise, primary motion, which is related to the movement of the sun over the course of a day. And then we have this zodiacal motion called secondary motion, which is related to how the planets move through the ecliptic, and that is related to the moon and the realm of fortune. So we have the sun, which is related to divinity, the one unchanging of knowing, and we have the movement of the zodiac, which is related to forms coming into and passing out of being. And the planets will, because the planets were called grahas or grabbers, right? This is something I've learned in my nightly astrology class based on some of the Vedic teachings where they are trying to, grab our wills, our divine wills, and manifest things with them, okay? So when a planet is moving direct, it is moving in that sort of, lunar motion where it's trying to bring things into being or help them pass out of being. When it switches course and goes retrograde, it is moving in the motion of the sun. It is moving in primary motion in the divine will. So there may be something with this Mercury where we're trying to bring into being things where we're casting doubt, where we're bringing communications, we're bringing, Mercury was associated with technology and science and things like that. That's why people are like, oh my God, my car is going to break down, whatever, Mercury retrograde. But it's a divine course correction when a planet goes retrograde. And what is happening now is Mercury has gotten to, it is visible as the evening star right now, and it is moving under the beams as it goes retrograde. So we're having our condition of phasis saying, what is the work that we're going to be doing as Mercury is going to be entering the underworld? And Mercury as psychopomp entering the underworld, and I've been asking around about this. I've been asking different people, astrologers I know, what do you really think about what phase is Mercury really the psychopomp? And the answer I've been getting is that it is most in its psychopomp phase. Because I was like, is it the evening star Mercury? Is it when it's below the horizon, or is it under the beams? And I keep coming back to from multiple sources that Mercury, is always the psychopomp, but it is most thematically psychopomp when it is under the beams or invisible. And that is when it's within 15 degrees of the sun. So Mercury is going to be entering the underworld as it goes underneath the beams of the sun, potentially trying to recollect all the pieces of our shattered worldviews to create something new. And it's going to be coming into conjunction with the sun. I don't know the exact date of that, but it's probably, let's see, let's just look real quick. When are we going to have our Kazemi moment? I'm going to clear my screen here because I think that might inform and give us some kind of, okay, it's gonna, let's see here, right around here, right around July 1st or so. Yeah. Yep. Around July 1st, we're going to see that Mercury going Kazemi, where it's in the heart of the sun. And it's getting that new divine assignment. All the old is going to be burned away. And maybe we've collected all the pieces and we're starting to reassemble them again so that we can have some kind of new birth. Okay, so we're going back here. I'm going to go back to Thursday the 16th. Okay, so what does that mean for us as a collective? Now, the other thing to keep in mind is we have a particular decan that Mercury is going to be acting within at this station. That's the second decan of Cancer, which has dual rulership of Mercury, its own being in its own decan, and Mars. And it is represented in the tarot by the Three of Cups. And in it we see three women, the three graces, holding the cups of celebration and abundance. And the three graces, according to Hesiod, had qualities of shining, joy, and blooming. And they were called the charities, and they were attendants of the Olympian gods, which I think can bring up another signification with Cancer and nurturing. So these charities were using their graceful qualities, hence the three graces, to help nurture divinity. So what can we do with Mercury in this position? Well, maybe we can start getting in touch with our nurturing charitable qualities to begin to attend to the divine assignments that we've been given through all of these other planetary omens, through our ability to be joyful, the ability to shine our light, the ability to fertilize the seeds of change. I thought that was another really interesting signification when we talk about this. So what's going to happen with this Mercury synodic cycle is Mercury is going to retrograde. It's going to come to that Cazimi moment at the heart of the sun, and then it's going to start emerging from the beams and make its appearance as a morning star when it rises above or before the sun, okay? And then it will start coming back into conjunction with the sun from a direct path where we have the superior conjunction. This conjunction that we'll have when it's retrograde is called the inferior conjunction. And that was said to be kind of the start of the cycle. So we've got an old Mercury right now, a wise Mercury that is trying to make sense of everything that's come before and release things. Again, gathering up all the pieces so that we can eventually make a new birth, right? Like Isis. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, as we move forward towards our eclipse, this Mercury station is happening very close to the United States solar position. I believe that the sun in the United States Sibley chart, which is one that they commonly use for it, is at 13 degrees of Cancer. So we have, themes of Sirius associated with the United States, this quest for immortality as well, maybe even at the expense of the body. But also, we're going to be seeing, Mercury retrograding right over the United States's sensory organ and how they are crafting identity. So we may be having a lot of questions. We may be diving into the underworld of how we are creating our identity as a country. And that identity has some positive things and that identity has some negative things. And right now we're coming to terms with the Pluto return as well, with the corruption that has lied beneath the surface. And part of the way that we formed the country off the backs of indentured servitude, slave labor, and cultural genocide with Native Americans, and bringing slaves from Africa. That is part of our history that we're having to reckon with right now. Now, don't get me wrong, there's some good things about America. I love my country, but there are definitely things that we have to reckon with as a society before we can move any further in the narrative of our collective mythology here. And Mercury is going to be playing a huge role in that moving forward. Okay. So hopefully that was clear. I'm having a lot of fun with Liz Greene. And I always love learning new things. And I had a really good class today with Achyuta Baba too. I'm retaking both his year 2 class and his horary class. And he went back in Mercury retrograde fashion and redid a lot of his offerings. And I just want to give him a real shout out, because he did a lot of hard work, and I can tell that the offerings he's going to make this semester are going to really be great, and are going to be they're well organized, and I can tell that he put in a lot of hard work, and I'm really excited about going back and learning these things again. This is complicated material, and sometimes the first pass through learning something, you may not get it, all of it. And I've had, when I was teaching guitar classes, people would take it a first time and they'd get to a certain level, and then they'd come back and retake it, and that's when they really took off. And I'm really excited about that possibility in my own practice, is continually going back to the themes and relearning these things to get greater and greater levels of depth. Okay. And you can see that right as Mercury is stationing, like relearning stuff. That may be something that we play out as a collective too. Okay, so on June the 19th, Friday, the moon is going to be in Gemini. It's balsamic phase. The moon is going to be conjoining retrograde Venus at 4:39 a.m. at 6 degrees of Gemini. And then the only other real aspect we have of the day is the sun is going to be making a conjunction to the north node at 29 degrees of Gemini at 7:30 p.m. That's a kind of an important moment too, because we're going to be seeing an increase in solar significations. Remember, the north node was a point of increase. And so we may be feeling an increased desire or an increased awareness of what needs to stay and what needs to go. Remember, that third decan of Gemini was about the death of one of the twins, and subsequently the sacrifice of some of the immortality, so that they could, alternate between the underworld and Mount Olympus. So we're really making a choice. We've had this proliferation of options. We're gaining the information, and then we're deciding what we're gonna nurture moving forward. And that awareness could be increased. That desire for that awareness, or even to, if you think about it, maybe even some of the instability could be increased. Being hosted by Mercury, with the sun being on the north node. Now, just kind of off the top of my head, when we have the sun on the north node too, now I believe that this is a combination that Donald Trump has in his chart, the sun very close to the north node. You have a desire for power. And we can think of the north node not just as a point of increase, which it is. It is sort of like a doorway or a gateway, where the south node is a gateway where energy is leaving. But we don't necessarily have a judgment as whether it's good or bad, though. Remember, in the Vedic system, in the Jyotish system, they thought of it as a hungry dragon, the head of a dragon, the north node, that was never able to be satiated. It was trying to consume the elixir of life, and this is a strong desire for something that can never be satisfied. There's never enough power for a sun north node conjunction. There's never enough authority. There's never enough, I don't know. I don't, I don't know. Just think about that. And we could see that play out in the collective, where we may see a power grab, or something like where we're seeing someone exert more, or try to exert more authority with a sun north node conjunction. Okay. So the other thing that's happening on Friday the 19th is the moon is going to fall under the bond, where at 14 degrees Gemini, it is going to be kind of disappearing, right? And going within that 15-degree orb of the sun, getting ready to be reborn. So it's like the moon's going into that underworld phase, and going into the furnace or the heart of the sun. That happens about 8:13 p.m. So pay attention to the evening on Friday. If there are themes that you may be working through before the eclipse, it may give you some clues to understanding what you're going to be asked to bring awareness to at the new karmic cycle. Okay, I'm going to move forward to Saturday, because we got a busy day, Saturday and Sunday. Hanging in there with me? I'm realizing how long-winded I am with these, but I don't know. I think it's fun. There are astrologers out there that will give you the shorter, more concise version, and it's like Do you want the long form or the short form, you know? And everything has its place. Okay, on Saturday the 20th, the moon is still in Gemini in its balsamic phase. So really, like, that moon is really at its darkest phase. It's going to be making a square to Neptune at 9:06 a.m. at 20 degrees of Gemini. And then it's going to be squaring Mars at 25 degrees of Gemini and Pisces at 5:47 p.m. Now, before the square to Mars, the sun finally makes its ingress into the sign of Cancer. Okay, so let's move forward a little bit. We do have one non-lunar aspect of the day, which is Mars is going to be making a sextile to retrograde Jupiter. So that is part of our collective story here. So similar themes with the Mars Pluto sextile I talked about earlier, but adding in significations of Jupiter, which talks about potential self-glorification, self-aggrandizement, a boisterous, rambunctious style. These are significations according to Ren Butler in his great book, The Archetypal Universe. Taking action on our beliefs. He talks about in that book themes of nationalism and imperialism, like the expansion of warlike impulses or anger and heat. Now remember, we may be taking actions drawing upon that third decan of Pisces, where we have a belief system where we're trying to sacrifice based on some kind of belief that we're doing the divine's will, right? But right now, Jupiter is not in the greatest shape. We're not trying to create growth with Jupiter. We're having difficulty with it being retrograde and in its fall, not drawing our wisdom from materiality, where we may be drawing the desire to expand and affirm from things that have outlived their time and through material structures rather than from our higher self. So that's something to keep an eye on. And that, I would say, that kind of fits thematically with what I was talking about earlier with the sun making its conjunction with the North Node and all of the ramifications of that in the collective. So let's talk a little bit about the sun in Cancer. And this will give us some thematic material to unpack the eclipse as well, because the eclipse is going to happen at 0 degrees of Cancer very early on Sunday, the 21st. So I'll be able to kind of talk about both of those things moving forward here. So when the sun moves into Cancer, as we can see here around, roughly around 5:45 in the evening, we experience the summer solstice. And the summer solstice is where the sun is at its peak declination, or its peak height in the sky, and where the day is the longest, and we are seeing the height of solar power, and it starts to decline or descend back towards the earth after that, where the nights start to increase in length. And it's interesting because we sort of in the West have some significations with the beginning of the zodiac being Aries, and that being the start of the spring equinox, right? And there's some good arguments to be made for that. But in the Egyptian concept of time, Cancer was on the ascendant and was the beginning of their calendar, basically. And that coincided with the flooding of the Nile and the primordial waters and the ability of water to give life. This is something where we are experiencing a new host for the sun, where we have the moon is now hosting the sun. And the moon has significations in relationship with water as well, with the tides. The gravity of the moon, creates the tide coming in and the tide going out. So we have a symbol of the crab, and the crab is on the border of the earth and of the waters, and it can go in between both. So there is this quality with Cancer of moving between worlds, moving between the unconscious and the conscious, of the divine and the realm of form. And I thought that brought up a really interesting realization of the moon as being this great manifester, but also it was associated with birth and decay, right? And so you think about Cancer, and I have some experience with this being Cancer Sun and Mercury, about going into the depths of our minds, of our spirits, and trying to bring something back. And this is something that I experienced a lot as a musician and as an artist, where I was really, it talked about the labor pains of going into the darkness and the confusion that can happen when you are trying to manifest something. I felt a lot of that pain as an artist, and it was all consuming as well. It was not just this kind of, it was not something that I took lightly. And maybe this is Sirius conjoining my son, but I felt there was a great sense of purpose when I was making art, and it had to be perfect and it had to be divine, you know? And it led to a lot of doubt. And this, I was wondering, I've always wondered about the self-doubt associated with Cancer. And Liz Greene made some really great points about this. And I wanted to read a little bit more from her book. So she talks about Cancer, and there are multiple themes we have to unpack with that. Um, First of all, she compares, she talks about Cancer in relationship to Thetis, the sea goddess or the sea monster that was like the creator goddess, who was basically like the ocean herself, you know, the primordial ocean of the dark matter, so to speak, that forms came out of. You see this in Hermetic wisdom too, where you have like the one mind and the one thing. The one mind being knowledge and being the breath that brings things into being, or the voice or the words that bring things into being. And then you have the one thing being the substance, where it is drawn from, where you have, you know, all the potentialities that are concretized when you give them breath or give them voice. And so we can think of Thetis as maybe, you know, associated with that one thing, those primordial waters, that ocean that has depth and has mystery. There's so many things beneath the surface that we don't know about. That's one of the places on the earth that we haven't even explored in its entirety yet. So I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about the moon too, and Cancer at the crab, being able to go into the primordial waters, bring forms back out of it, and do those deep dives, so to speak. Okay, let me think for a second. Another thing that she compares Cancer, the sign of Cancer, the temple of Cancer, to, is the Ouroboros, and that's the snake that's consuming its own tail. And this is echoed in Austin Coppock's work about the first decan of Cancer, which we're seeing right now with the mother archetype. And we have to think about the mother archetype not just as nurturing, but as consuming as well. Um, for a mother to provide for her children, she has to consume lots of food, lots of nutrients, so that she can create nurturing for the child. So there's this constant cyclical process of consuming and then feeding and consuming and feeding and consuming and feeding. And so that can be thought of as that Ouroboros eating its own tail, this cycle of eternity going round and round. Okay, so let me read you something, because she talks about Thetis, that primordial oceanic goddess, and her relationship with a man called Peleus. And then, of course, that union being boring a son, Achilles. So there was some children that they had, and well, I'll just read it for you. It says, the result of wranglings on Olympus about the fate of Thetis was that she married a man called Peleus. By him she bore the famous hero Achilles, who bears all the hallmarks of a Cancer. Graves calls this behavior hysterical when he sulks in his tent before the walls of Troy. And in childhood, Thetis tried to protect him from involvement with the Trojan War by dressing him up as a woman. Thetis, in fact, bore 7 sons to Peleus, and true to her matriarchal nature, she could not bear the idea that these would be mortal children who were doomed to die. She managed to steal 6 of them and burn off their mortal flesh so that they might ascend to Olympus and take their places among the gods. Peleus was outraged by this destruction of his sons and managed to rescue Achilles just before all of his children were burned away. The father kept his hand firmly on the son's ankle bone, which remained mortal. This version of the tale seems to predate the story that Thetis dipped her son in the river Styx to render him immortal, forgetting the ankle she was holding. But the sentiment in both tales is the same. When I have encountered this myth in work in human lives, it often takes the form of a numinous projection upon a favored or beloved child, who is expected to reach Olympian heights, even if the child's humanity is destroyed in the process. Sometimes Cancer, if there is no actual children upon whom this vision of superhuman performance can be projected, will nurture this attitude towards his own creativity, finding anything that comes out of him flawed and distasteful unless it is divine. There seems to be an issue here of why Cancer often will not live out his creative potential himself, but will wait until a beloved partner or child can perform the task. Wow. When I read that, I felt like extraordinarily called out. Here's a few things why. And I've lived both forms of this. I've lived both. I've lived as the artist who felt like whatever came out of him was flawed and never satisfied with it. And even to the point where it was just so painful I waited a decade from the time that I said, I'm going to make an album at age 23 to actually releasing said album at age 34. So you can see like that. And the whole time, the main obstacle, besides just like living my life and other things that were pulling me away from completion, was this nagging self-doubt that what I was creating wasn't good enough, wasn't divine enough. I had a musical hero named Jeff Buckley who I felt embodied the divinity pretty intensely. And I was always, comparing myself to people like Jeff Buckley and not to like just regular artists. And I would compare my work to like the Beatles, some of the most prolific artists out there, and to like Michael Jackson, some of the most prodigious artists out there, and say, is it that good? And if in my mind I didn't think that it was, I was like, I'm not gonna release this. It was that was the pain that I think that she's discussing here. And I ended up having a shift in my life where my daughter came to live with me after a period of having just having regular, just non-custodial parent visitation. And something shifted with that as well, where we got, and you've heard this if you've listened to me in the past, where we got involved with competitive swimming. And that's all been really put on hold since the pandemic. And I've had a lot of time to reflect on that. Like, you've heard me talk in this literally about like, maybe my child will go to the Olympics. Like, and here Liz Greene says, the form of a numinous projection upon a favored and beloved child who is expected to reach Olympian heights, even if the child's humanity is destroyed in the process. And I just have to laugh at that because there's just a moment of recognition where I was like, oh my God, have I been trying to push my child to, Olympian heights? And I've also, described the way that I practiced my singing as an Olympic effort too. Like I was like, I have to be the Olympic singer, the Olympic, equivalent of a singer. And yeah, just a knowing and a realization and a pronoia, right, about that. And yeah, I just will leave that there. Um, you know, not that I, was a parent that was, mm, I don't think that I drove my own kid to suffering through that, but it was definitely an instance where I projected my desire for divinity and for greatness and for the heights of immortality. I could see myself doing that through her swimming, and totally recognize that. Um, yeah, and so I don't know what more I have to say about that. Just that Liz Greene, Liz Greene, you got me, Liz. You got me. And as Cancerian, as we move into Cancer season and everything Cancerian, it's not just that mother archetype. It's, are we going to? And I think that as this eclipse is happening, are we going to, as a collective, project our divinity onto some kind of uh, reflected body, right? The moon reflects, it shines with reflected light. And that light could be the light of our own divinity, or it could be the trying to reflect the light of someone else's divinity or something like that. And I'm very curious to see how we may project our desire for immortality, divinity, and light through this eclipse. And as a country, what are we going to attempt to lift to Olympian heights? What is going to become the new savior, or the new, this will be how I express my creativity? This is the new deity that we are trying to glorify and trying to create through immortality. I'm very curious to see how that plays out in the collective moving forward, because I think it's something to be wary of and to be careful of. Um, there was a quote that Liz Greene talked about with this author Eric Newman, where he talks about Ouroboros incest, Ouroboros incest, where it's the longing to retreat from life into the embrace of the world parent or the divine source. Um, and I can also attest to that and confirm that as a person who is influenced by this energy, a desire to retreat from the world and to shelter in the, um, I don't know, into the waters of my mind and the waters of my own imagination, into the safety and that longing to reconnect with a lost, with a separation that happens when we leave the primordial union and the oneness. When we there are many different philosophical uh, schools of thought that talk about, as souls, we are, before we incarnate in a body, we are part of the divine one. And as we incarnate a soul into the body, we leave that divine consciousness that is unified, and we are separated into this particular point of consciousness. And there religious and spiritual practices about how do you reconnect with the divine, because you are born into this, kind of, oh, I don't know, this awareness of separateness, this ignorance, and that life is a struggle to return to that unity. And we can compare this to this teenage longing, this romantic longing for the other. And I can confirm that as a teenager, I spent many days and nights just, I don't know, longing for something. And there were various times where I would project that on a romantic partner. There are various times where I would project that on some concept. And really just this material is helping me really realize that that's a longing for a union with with God and with the divine. And that's a powerful thing that we're going to be experiencing, especially with the eclipse happening on 0 degrees of Cancer, right on the solstice point. So let's move. I want to move forward to Sunday so we can kind of unpack that eclipse. Okay. Um, so we're talking about June 21st, Sunday. And you can see that this eclipse is going to happen at about 2 o'clock in the morning, roughly. Okay. Here we see that time. There we go. Yeah, it's going to be exact. Oh, in my area, around 2:41 Eastern Standard Time. And every time we have eclipses, we have the sun or one of the lights in close proximity to one of the nodes. And in this case, both the sun and the moon are being conjoined by the north node, the head of the dragon. And the sun is going to be consumed by the dragon and darkened. So this is a darkening of the solar light. And I've read some things about eclipses where, if one of the lights is consumed, that lets the other concept run wild. And if we have the solar light being consumed, that is our rational knowing. That is our connection to source, our connection to rationality. And if we're going to shut that off for a period of time, well, what is left? Are, the night, the darkness, the all of the reflected light and the unconscious things that are buried within the depths, all of the sea monsters, all of Thetis's boiling and writhing within the primordial sea is kind of unleashed. And that's why, eclipses were thought of as malefic events in traditional astrology. They weren't like, I know people are like, it's a portal that's open. Well, sometimes portals open things that open, things like Pandora's box and unleashing, death and destruction onto the world. Now, if you want to go through that myth, uh, Pandora's box basically was a gift. Well, I don't know. I'm not going to try to, clumsily fumble my way through it. But basically, what was released onto the earth was, death, destruction, decay, entropy, and what was left in the box was hope. So that was the one good thing. So maybe with some of these eclipses, we may unleash some of our darker, more repressed natures, especially at the solar eclipse. But we have to use our hope to get us through it. So what we are experiencing with this eclipse is a seminal moment, right? It is at both a powerful birth, a karmic seed, but it has greater significance for the long term. Generally, when we have new moons, they are karmic seeds. But when we have new moon eclipses, they are major signposts or chapter markers in our collective narratives that are going to be playing out over the next 6 months, over the next many years, if you want to like expand it out in like a spiral. They take on greater importance. And this one being conjoined the solstice point is just supercharged. I believe it's fairly close to a conjunction with the United States Venus at about 3 degrees of Cancer. So it's pretty close to that. In that Sibley chart, Venus rules the 11th house of groups and the 6th house of illness, injury, slavery. Like, isn't that interesting? There may be some reckoning that happens with our collective belief system, 11th house, and how we've, manifested labor and bad fortune over the, course of our history too. Um, we're going to be asked to think about how we are nurturing and how we are providing nurturing for others at this eclipse. Um, the host moon is in its own domicile, so equally powerful. Like, it is very powerful. Sometimes when we have new moons, we have to look at the where the moon is being hosted, but here it is in its own domicile, right? Um, Mercury retrograde is co-present with this eclipse, so that is part of our story. Again, we've talked about that in depth this week. We do have Mars making a whole sign aspect by trine, so being willing to fight or sacrifice for beliefs is part of the story. We also have a whole sign opposition from Jupiter and Pluto, so that is part of the narrative as well. So potentially the new start that we're trying to make and the new nurturing, the new sustenance we're trying to provide is at odds with um, the desire to expand maybe the systems that are corrupt. And so that may be part of our conflict that we're experiencing as well. And we do have a sextile from Uranus to this lunation as well. So Uranus may be trying to assist, trying to provide positive Promethean change. Um, I don't know if that's how Uranus actually works, like providing like a planet would, but it's going to be part of the story, that's for sure. Okay. So I think that pretty much covers what we are going to be experiencing throughout our next few days here. Big changes. And we're, like I said, we're in that Bardo period where we're in the liminal space where we don't really know what we're going to be experiencing next. It's all kind of in flux, and that's okay. You don't have to know right away. We're going to have another full moon lunar eclipse in the beginning of July. That's when the clarity might start to happen. That full moon lunar eclipse is on July 5th. Okay, so that's when we might start to get to know what direction we're going here. Next week, Neptune will turn retrograde on Tuesday the 23rd. Venus turns direct on the 25th of June at 5 degrees of Gemini. What else? We're going to have a first quarter moon on Sunday the 28th with a square between a Libra moon and the sun in Cancer. And then Mars will be making a sextile to Saturn. Okay. I think that's what I've got for this week. So I hope that you are all doing well out there. If you are enjoying these videos, I'm doing my best to bring you as much information as I can. It's a lot of work. If you're liking these videos, make sure that you're hitting the subscribe button and sharing it with your friends. If you'd like to materially support the work that I'm doing, I have a Venmo account at Spencer Michaud that you can make a donation. I do have a PayPal Me account as well. That is a great way to support future episodes of the podcast here. That helps me to free up more time to do the research that I do. I put a lot of hours into the research that I do, and by your financial support, that allows me to do more of that without distraction. Also, a great way to support the work I do is to reach out and schedule a reading. I always love to do readings for my clients and to get to know my audience out there. That's a great way. You can reach out at spencermichaudastrology.com. Yeah, so that's what I've got for this week. I hope that you're all doing well and hang in there. I know that it may feel like there's a lot of things going on right now and a lot of uncertainty, but it's okay. Hermes is going down into the underworld and hopefully reconstructing from what is left of the old, so that we can bring about that new rebirth moving forward. And Horus was a pretty cool deity. So Horus was the sun that was created from the union of the old pieces of Osiris and Isis. So some wisdom. What the god Horus was about wisdom and about sight. So we may be really able to birth some new wisdom from some of these experiences that we're going through. So I commend all of you for doing the hard work and self-examination and being involved in your communities. And I hope that you'll continue to do that hard work and sustain that effort over time, because that's the way that we're ultimately gonna be successful with this, is that sustained effort over time. So anyway, I'll talk to you all soon. Take care, everyone. Peace.